you haven't learned this already, I will tell you now that wishing it were so will not make it so. It seems at times today that there are voices making wishes that we would totally separate church and state. They hold up the words of the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, which reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The intent of this clause was to limit the power of the federal government in regard to religion, thus ensuring freedom of religion within the United States of America. The phrase separation of church and state is not in the Constitution or in the amendments, but is rather traced, they believe, to a January 1st, 1820 letter written by Thomas Jefferson, who did author the Declaration of Independence. He addresses the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut. And this letter got published in the Massachusetts newspaper, in which he wrote, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. But it would seem that there are some that would wish that God, the church, religion would be separated out from anything that deals with government. Kind of a once and for all, fully inclusive, fully divide between church and state. But I'm going to maintain that the truth of the matter is that that just can't happen. You see, not if we stick to our understanding of God. For you see, God does not want or choose to be separate from our public life. And we cannot dictate to God where God will go and where God will be made known. Now, the church is not God. We're talking about the separation of church and state at this moment. The church is not God, but does anybody remember what it is? It is the what of God? Representation of God in the world. That wasn't our idea. That's how God left it. Jesus said, go, you will be filled with the Holy Spirit, and you will be my witnesses. The church becomes the representation of God in the world. So, God doesn't want the church separated out from public life either. In fact, the exact opposite, I would say. God and His church should be right in the middle of every aspect of our lives. Today, we're completing a sermon series with 4 little words, 12 letters, which we have looked at for a couple of months now with a little bit of break the last couple of weeks. And today we're looking again at In God We Trust. We've already looked at other things we shouldn't trust in, ourselves, our money, even the church. Today, though, we're going to look at not trusting in the government. Over the past few weeks, we've looked at these things as great instruments of God, but not the end in itself of who we worship or who we trust. So as we did with the other topics, we're going to look at God's role in the midst of us, our money, our church, our very selves. Today we're going to look at the work of God through and in our government. This sermon was finished up by Tuesday afternoon. That's partly because sermon notes need to be done, and that's just, I like to do things ahead. So that's my pattern. So this sermon was done, ready to go, before Thursday night, when I left a meeting here and turned on the radio, which was on news, and I was trying to piece it together, but long story short, it was the aftermath of the Dallas shootings. And they didn't even know that's what it was. They just knew there were protests, they knew there were people down. But this sermon that was written before that, God alone knew, would fit extremely well this week. Because you see, today, I think we're more aware than ever how desperately we need to be in prayer for our nation, for our government, and for those in authority over us. Nations, as is true of all things, were ordained and established by God. Nations, as is true of all things, were ordained and established by God. That's another main reason we cannot separate out God and the church and government. Because God's the creator of all things, even our government. And go all the way back to Deuteronomy, when the nation of Israel is just being formed as God's people. And in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, it says this: when the Most High assigned land to the nations, when he divided up the human race, he established the boundaries of the peoples according to the numbers of his heavenly court. Now, I don't know about the according to the numbers of his heavenly court, but that clearly says God divides up nations. God establishes nations. God divides up people in places and puts the boundaries around them. God is behind and in and around all of these things, whether we acknowledge it or not. Thanks be to God, here in the United States, our founding fathers and mothers did acknowledge it. Hold on 1 second here. They did acknowledge it. There is much. I mean, the fact that we're talking about in God we trust, remember, is our national motto as of 1956. It's been on our paper currency, though, on our coinage since 1859. So, we're looking at in God we trust, not the government. In God, not the government we trust. Excuse me. But we want to see that as an instrument that God uses. So whether we acknowledge or not, whether nations want to acknowledge God's sovereignty or not, is up to them. But it doesn't change the fact that God is over all of it. Money, the church, our government, and even ourselves are all just instruments in God's hand to use to bless us and others. Money, the church, our government, or even ourselves are all just instruments in God's hands to bless us and others. Do you see that part of the blessing? These are not meant to be dictatorial things. They're meant to be assets to us, to enable us to do the work of ministry, including the overseeing of authorities in government, to give us guidance. I thank God there are traffic laws. Do I obey them to the nth degree? No. I mean, my teenagers would tell you not. There's nothing harder, if you've ever done this, which many of you have, to do is to have driven for a number of years and then have someone take a class on driver education. And suddenly, there's very little you do correctly. I won't even ask how many of you, I won't ask for show of hands, how many of you know that you're supposed to reduce your speed by 1/3 when it is raining outside? I was educated on that going down 54 with a line of cars behind me and a very insistent teenager. No, Mom, you're not supposed to go over. You've got to reduce your speed by 55 into thirds, so you need to be going about 42 miles an hour. We got to Ashland, but not with people behind us happy. I'm thankful there are traffic laws, because when I get up here to the crossroads, I count on the fact, well, actually I don't, but I know they're supposed to stop before I turn. I don't ever go through that intersection really quickly, but most of the time people do. And when I'm in a metropolitan area, I absolutely count that when the light's red, those people are going to stop and I'm going to go when it's green. So there's very, very good things about having government in our lives. That's just one little example. You see, the government established by God, created by God, though, is just an instrument of God. It's used to bless us and others. But it's not the one we put our trust in. Just an instrument of the one we trust in. Just like money, the church, and ourselves. That's what we've got that I want to leave us with as we leave this sermon series. None of these things are bad in and of themselves. They just aren't where our trust should be. Our trust is a step beyond them, at the God that's behind them all. In our text this morning, the psalmist David's describing why he can trust God to meet our needs, instead of trusting in anything that God has given us. Because you see, God may use those things, but our trust is in the God who's given us the blessings. Let's dive into this Psalm 145, beginning with verse 13. David says, "For your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. You rule throughout all generations. The Lord always keeps his promises. He's gracious in all he does." Talk about nations and nationalities. God's kingdom is everlasting and will never fail. Rules throughout all generations, always keeps his promises. We're going to hear a lot of promises between now and sometime in early November. I'll leave that to you to contemplate. This scripture says God always keeps his. The Lord helps the fallen and lifts those bent beneath their loads. All government aid really is given by God through these sources, through these places. Verse 15, the eyes of all look to you in hope. You give them their food as they need it. When you open your hand, you satisfy the hunger and thirst of every living thing. You satisfy, God, those things. Hanover County has a 20.9% rate of students who are eligible for either reduced or free lunch. That's grades kindergarten through 12. Here in Beaverdam Elementary, that percentage goes up to 28.5% that are eligible to receive government federal lunch program, either reduced or free. Where my husband Scott teaches in Petersburg City Schools, that percentage is 92.8%. So, federal lunch programs, supplemental nutritional assistance programs that are known as SNAP, Women's, Infants, and Children, also known as WIC, even our local food pantry for week. All of those are instruments that God uses to provide all things and is trustworthy to provide. You see, especially the food pantry, because we do that as people of faith, but all of the other things are there, yes. And you can argue, it looks like the government's doing that. But if we hold to the theology that all things come from God and all things belong to God, and especially money belongs to God, then the federal government doesn't have anything if we don't pay our taxes or they don't raise it some other way. And any money that's out there, we hold came from God. Anything that's out there, we maintain, ultimately began with God. So we don't just see ourselves and our money or even the church as the one we trust. We would want to place our trust instead in Jesus Christ and God and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Not finished yet. Verse 17. The Lord is righteous in everything he does. He's filled with kindness. The Lord is close to all who call on him. Yes, to all who call on him in truth. He grants the desires of those who fear him. He hears their cries for help and rescues them. And I couldn't help but think of, like, since we were talking about government agencies anyway, but I thought of FEMA. You know, after a flood or a hurricane or tornadoes, FEMA is called on, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, okay? And they come in, Red Cross even. Now that's not a government entity, that's a charitable organization. But those things are instruments still of the God who's going to provide. This psalm, way back before we had the United States of America, before we had government aid of any description per se, he writes, this is the source of the one who feeds us, clothes us, gives us food, protects us, hears our cries, rescues us. Verse 20, the Lord protects all those who love him, but he destroys the wicked. Again, written before the latter part of this week, American Armed Forces and the entire Defense Department of America are just that, instruments. You guessed it, in the hands of our God. Thank God for them. But we don't place our trust there. David ends with, I will praise the Lord and make everyone on earth bless his holy name forever and ever. David says, I'm praising God and hoping that everybody else blesses God's name too. You see, throughout this entire sermon series, we're looking at how God can be trusted instead of the many other things we could be tempted to place our trust in instead. This same David, who wrote Psalm 145, gives us Psalm 33 too. You see, David knows who made him king. He is king. David knows whose kingdom is really everlasting, and it's not David's. And God says, I will establish your throne forever. And he sends Jesus through the line of David, but it's not about David, and David knows it. And he sums up the relationship of God, in my opinion, of God and state in this verse. Verse 33, what joy for the nation whose God is the Lord, whose people is chosen as his inheritance. What joy for the nation whose God is the Lord, whose people is chosen as his inheritance. what joy indeed. Amen.